Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Experience podcast where we talk to you about the creative and professional aspect, creative and business aspects, I should say, of being a professional comic book creator. My name is Gamal Hennessy. The gentleman virtually beside me is Andy Schmidt. And today we're actually talking about the people who are going to be reading your comic because it doesn't make sense to actually create a comic and then try to put it out into the world and expect everyone to read it. Because the fact of the matter is, everyone doesn't read anything. There's every book has a specific audience. The same way every TV show, every song, every movie has a specific audience. Now that audience may be large or small, but you cannot expect mass adoption of your book because that's not the way media works, especially in the 21st century where we have so many micro niches that people can focus on exactly what they want to the exclusion of almost everything else. Now, Andy, you've actually been both an editor and a publisher. So when books come in, or when you're actually going to publish a book, how do you go about figuring out who the audience is for that book and where you can actually find them so that you can sell them this amazing book?
Um, Really good question. So it sort of depends, right? So like one of the reasons why you might want to work with a publisher to publish your book is because that publisher already has a relationship with your intended audience
Mhm.
or audiences very similar to it.
Mhm.
Um, and that publisher may have a means of getting it to them, of distributing it to those places. So if that's the case, like if you're doing a superhero comic, just
Mhm.
to pick something out of thin air, like going with a distributor that distributes the same way that, or a publisher that distributes the same way Marvel and DC does to the same stores, that they are accessing superhero comic audiences, right? So
Mhm.
that's a fairly natural thing that yes, I would want to partner with that or find my own way to get it there.
Mhm.
Um, it gets harder when you're not sure that that there's a publisher out there that has a relationship with that audience, right? Then
Right.
you and or the publisher are going to have to do more work. So let's say, and I don't know why this is the example that popped in my head, but let's say you have a story that is about um, jousting competitions in like 500 AD, right?
Mhm.
Then um, that may not be the most mainstream comic, direct market comic sort of appeal. It could be, depending on some of the content involved or the
Mhm.
creators involved. But let's say that that's what it is, and the creators aren't super popular in the direct market. Doesn't mean it's a bad book. Could be a great book. So then the question is, how do I reach folks that would be interested in that? In an example like that, I would probably start reaching out to Renaissance fairs
Mhm.
and seeing if I can get a list of the dealers that are there and see who would want to carry the book. One of the reasons why a thing like Renaissance fairs would be, I think, really valuable to something like that is because it's a replenishing audience. That
Right.
they're going to new fairs all the time and they'll hopefully need to buy more and more stock. So you make a book that they can just sell over and over again and they can, even if it's just buying 5 copies at a time or 10 copies at a time, if they do that 10 times, you've had one customer that just bought 100 of your book or 50 of it.
Right. Right.
So there are things like that that make more sense than just a one-time purchase. You would maybe look for book clubs,
Mhm.
maybe fantasy book clubs, maybe historical fiction book clubs, maybe whatever. So you would once you've determined who that audience is, who that book is for, then you go see, hey, where can I find the places where they're going to be buying and looking for content. Also, to be quite honest, there's crowdfunding, there's eBay, there's um, Amazon,
Mhm.
all of which have tools where you can hopefully locate your that audience and bring them in. So there's a lot of different ways, but it does start with identifying that audience and then figuring out what's the best, easiest way for me. The other, to get to them, the other aspect of that that I'd like to mention is kind of, I hit on it, but I didn't call it out, which is maximizing finding the audience, right? So you don't want to just find a place where there's three people that might be interested in your book. You want to find a place like, in the example I gave, the Renaissance Fair, where it'll be repeat business, hopefully, and you'll continue to sell there, right? That's a really great type of,
Hmm.
client or customer to have. Whereas, hey, if I just go to the fair myself, right, and set up a booth, I've got one shot at whoever walks in that day.
Right.
If I'm distributing to them, to the other shops, they're selling my book for me and they're selling it at all the shows they go to.
Yes.
So maximizing your effort um, is really important.
Yes. Now, I would just point out that if you are selling it to the distributors who are then selling it to the customers, you have to keep in mind in your profit and loss statement that those distributors are going to be taking a cut. So
Oh,
whereas
for
you
sure.
will get higher value volume, you will also have to sacrifice some revenue for that. But it might make a lot more sense to be able to scale up in whatever environment you're in rather than trying to be in all of those environments yourself. One of the things when I wrote the business of independent comic book publishing, and we talk about marketing, the idea of finding your audience is the idea of identifying first who your ideal reader is. Who is the, when
Right.
you are making the book, who is the person that you envision like picking up the book? And in a lot of cases, you can figure out who that person is by deconstructing your own story. Like taking a step back from the actual beats of the narrative and look at the demographics, psychographics, generation, genre of the book itself will give you a lot of keys on who it is that is going to be reading the book. Look at the idea that people want to see themselves or people that they identify with in the stories they read, then you know who your protagonist is, what the conflict is, how they're resolving that conflict is going to tell you a lot about who's the audience is for that book. So, like you said, if you're going for, you know, the medieval Renaissance fair, because your book has is in it's a historical fiction story that has combat in it, that has all of these things, those elements will naturally lead you to something like a Renaissance fair. When we talk in the Q&As for Comics Experience about different types of marketing, we have quite a few of our pro members who have books about martial arts. So they specifically target martial arts tournaments. They specifically go on martial arts podcasts. They have other martial artists that they talk to who have significant followings of their own. And they don't spend a lot of time trying to fight their way into the direct market comic book shop because the direct market comic book shop, there is a certain Venn diagram of martial artists who go to the comic book shop, but it's not that big. There's a much bigger pool of martial arts people going to martial arts tournaments because that's kind of the point. So if you take a look at how your book is set up and what you actually put into your book, you can actually figure out who is going to be reading the book. And the one piece that I think we kind of skipped over, which because we're old, is the online piece. The
Yep.
idea that these groups of people, and it doesn't really make a difference, literally, it doesn't make a difference what your book is about. There are already groups of people who have already formed themselves online. They're on Facebook, they're on Reddit, they're on Blue Sky, they're already there. And through keyword searching and just kind of organic searching for those groups, you can find them. And like you said, you want to find a group that's large enough that it makes sense to kind of engage with them. A lot of these groups, there are thousands and thousands of people in those groups. If you can actually get into that group and be accepted by that group before you try to sell them something, they become like the natural pool of people who are going to go out and support your Kickstarter. They're going to buy your book. They're going to buy these secondary materials. They're going to add themselves to your newsletter. Those those segmented communities, which are not necessarily the greatest thing for the nation as a whole, but they are fantastic for marketing because they they're in a silo. They have already self-selected. You don't have to go out and find them in the same way that people who get up, get in their cars, go to the Renaissance Fair, get dressed up as a knight, and then, I don't know, drink mead, which is what I assume they're doing. Um,
That's what I do there.
exactly. But then that's those people have really self-selected because there's several steps that they have to go through to get to that thing. And when they see your book, that becomes a reward for actually going to that place. There's a much more subtle and much more consistent kind of access you can use if you find those groups online and again become part of those groups. And that is where your audience is. The key is because you made a comic, and this is a mistake that a lot of comic creators and even a lot of comic book publishers make, is they make a comic and they feel like the people they have to talk to are people who read comics. But they forget the idea that a comic book is a media. It is not the message itself. A comic book could be about anything. So the fact that someone reads comics does not mean they're going to read your comic because they might not like the type of story that you're telling in your comic. Whereas if you focus on the type of story, it may not make a difference that it's a comic relative to a TV show or a video game or something else. Because comics have a certain stigma in the United States still, there may be some education to kind of convince them to try a comic, but it'll be much easier to get them to try a comic about something they already like, as opposed to just trying to get them to buy a comic because it's Daredevil and they don't like superheroes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. One thing I'll also point out is that I pass on a lot of pitches because I read the story and I read the pitch and I don't know who it's for. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think the creators do either. I think that sometimes and then sometimes I'll ask, like, who do you see the audience for this being? And if the answer I get back is, well, it's for this type of person, and it's like a long list of, you know, people that where I don't see a Venn diagram that overlaps
Mm-hmm.
those 10 things, then it feels like, often I get a thing where it feels like somebody's trying to make something for everything and then misses everyone.
Right.
Or or it's so niche that I just don't think there's a big enough audience for it. I get
Not
that a
at all.
lot. I go to a fair number of art schools, to review portfolios of, often like graduating seniors, and they've got their comics pitches. And, I'll ask, who is this for? And a lot of times it's like, well, this is for people like, going through this type of thing that I went through. And then
Mm-hmm.
the question is, how are you going to get that to those folks? And I swear they've never been asked that question before.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it sucks that often the creator has to figure that out because most creators aren't really interested in market research. But that is, but that
Actually, no
is,
creator is interested in market research. No,
but
like
that
zero.
is, yeah, but that is a reality. Is if you're making something like you want it to be specific enough that you can identify
Hmm.
this is a group of people that I want. This is a group of people that I think would really like it. But it can't be so narrow that it's the audience of one, like that it's audience of just for you. And that's a hard target to hit. Like just at the outset, that alone is difficult. Then on top of that, it's got to be good and compelling and priced correctly, and you've got to do the outreach and all that sort of stuff. So, but
Well, I do
yeah,
want to ask a question in going in the opposite direction. So we're
okay.
saying that the audience cannot be too small so that it doesn't make business sense to actually, publish the comic. What about the pitches you receive that are basically trying to be another shared superhero universe? Where there's a market because there's tens of thousands of people that buy those books. But
Right.
how do you deal with those pitches knowing that Marvel has been there since, 1960 something. DC's been there since 1939. Image has been there for 40 years. Valiant's been there for 30 years. What do you do when you know who the book is for, and you also know that there's 60 books a month that come out exactly for that group of people?
Right. Uh, well, then the question is, why would someone buy this book
Mhm.
instead of or on top of all of those books? Because most of those things that you just mentioned come with a long line of character loyalty, brand loyalty,
Mhm.
brand confidence, whether
Right.
whether deserved or not. Um,
It's a perception. We're not talking
right,
about reality. We're talking about
right.
perception.
Yeah, so why is somebody going to buy your version of Wolverine when they could have Wolverine, right?
And have like
By
6 issues of it every month.
right, right, and by creators that they already know that they like
Hmm.
or have a confidence that they will like. Um, so I think for me, it's what does this project bring to superheroes that Marvel, DC, and Image either can't or are highly unlikely to? And then then again, is that compelling? Is that
Right.
thing something I can sell? So like for example, CX did Saga of the Doomed Universe, which is a big superhero universe. Like it's one title, but it was essentially it was like having the Marvel or the DC universe have a big
Mm-hmm.
crossover just all in one big book. And the thing that when it was first sort of pitched to me by Scott Reed, the creator, he was like, "Yeah, it's like having your own, crossover." And I'm like, "Well, that's cool, but like, what else is it doing?" And I was surprised when he was like, "Well, it has this whole commentary aspect on superheroes and on these crossovers, and it has this fourth wall breaking thing, very meta thing going on where like the creator of the comic you're reading is an active participant in the comic." And then I was like, okay, well, this sounds interesting. Could be
Mm-hmm.
a disaster, but it sounds interesting. And then when I actually read it, it was great. It was fabulous. It was really, really awesome. And so that was what put me over the top. Be like, yes, we should publish this because Marvel and DC never would.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really good. And I can talk to how it's different from what they do in their crossovers. And then we did, and then to sell the idea of that visually through the covers, we did homage covers to Marvel and DC event comics, and retailers and fans kind of went ape over them. And so it wound up doing very, very well in the very crowded market
Mm-hmm.
with very little brand loyalty to us. But that's a lot of hurdles
Right.
to overcome for me to greenlight a superhero project.
Well, I think that's the core of finding the audience. It's trying to hit that target where it's not too small that it just doesn't justify the production from a business standpoint, but not so large and so vague that you can't really identify a viable audience for it. If you can actually find that middle ground, and again, I realize that a lot of comic book writers, artists are not necessarily interested in sitting down and doing the market research required to, find that specific audience, engage with that audience, and kind of be accepted by that audience before the book comes out. So that is where one of the places where working with a publisher who is willing to do that, not just a publisher who's going to put it in their catalog and not engage with your audience, and that's where it makes sense to kind of seek out a licensing deal or a creator own deal because that publisher is bringing that kind of stuff to the table. So this is the kind of thing that we talk about a lot in working with that nuance in a lot of the courses and a lot of the discussions we have at Comics Experience. So when you finish listening to our um, elegant voices, you can go check out Comics Experience and join and get 1 month free with your subscription. So we're going to wrap things up there. I'm Gamal. He's Andy. And until next time, have fun with your comics.